Far out at the edge of known space, past the last friendly star, there was a small mining colony called Perch. It was not important to anyone. It had no army, no fleet, and no reason to expect trouble. The people who lived there mined rare metal from asteroids and sent it back to human space once a month. They lived quiet lives, far from war, far from danger. That quiet ended on an ordinary morning when the sky turned dark with ships that did not belong to any human nation. The ships belonged to the Kryvax Dominion, a vast alien empire that had swallowed thousands of worlds over thousands of years. The Dominion did not conquer through skill. It conquered through numbers and fear. Every species it had ever met broke long before the last battle was fought, because no one could stand against a fleet that seemed to have no end. Kryvax commanders did not plan clever tactics. They did not need to. They simply sent more ships than the enemy could count, and the enemy always surrendered. The scout fleet that came to Perch was small by Kryvax standards, only 12 ships, sent to test the defenses of this new species called humans, that the Dominion had heard whispers about from traders on the far frontier. The Kryvax commander of this fleet, a cautious officer named Vex Ithara, expected no resistance at all. Perch had no warships. It had no shields worth mentioning. It was supposed to be an easy first strike, a way to gather data on how humans reacted to fear. The colony sent out a distress signal the moment the first alien ship appeared on their sensors. That signal raced across the dark for 3 days before it reached a single human warship patrolling the border, a ship called the UNS Requiem. The Requiem was not a large ship. Compared to the war fleets of old empires, it looked almost small, sleek and dark, built for speed and precision, rather than brute size. It carried a crew of only 200, a tiny number next to the thousands that filled Kryvax capital ships. But the Requiem was not an old design. It was the newest ship in the human fleet, built using lessons that had cost humanity dearly, lessons written in blood during a war most of the galaxy had never heard about. Captain Elena Voss stood on the bridge when the distress call came through. She was young for a captain, only 34, but she had earned her rank the hard way, fighting pirates and rogue AI along the border for years. She had calm eyes and a quiet voice, the kind of voice that made people listen even when she was not shouting. "Confirmed alien signatures at Perch," said her tactical officer, a broad-shouldered man named Marcus Reyes. "Unknown design. 12 ships. Colony defenses are already down." "Distance?" Voss asked. 3 days at standard cruise. "We could shave that to 14 hours if we push the drive core." Voss did not hesitate. "Push it. Set course for Perch. Full alert." Her first officer, a sharp-eyed woman named Priya Nair, frowned at the numbers on her screen. "Captain, 12 unknown warships against 1 ship of ours. We don't know their weapons, their shields, anything. Command protocol says we should hold position and call for reinforcement." "Reinforcement is 11 days out," Voss said. "Perch does not have 11 days." She turned to face her crew. "We are not going there to win a war. We are going there to save the people we can save, and to learn what we are dealing with. If it becomes hopeless, we run. But we do not sit here and listen to a colony die while doing nothing." No one argued further. The Requiem's engines lit up, and the ship tore through the dark toward Perch. 14 hours later, the Requiem dropped out of its jump near the colony. What the crew saw on their screens made the bridge fall silent for a moment. Perch's outer stations were already burning. Small transport ships filled with fleeing colonists floated helpless, some already destroyed, their remains drifting in slow silence. The 12 Kryvax ships moved with lazy confidence, picking off the transports one by one, as if they had all the time in the world. "They're not even trying," Reyes said quietly. "They're hunting for sport." Voss felt something cold settle in her chest, the kind of anger that made her voice go very calm. "Reyes, options." Reyes brought up the tactical display. "Their ships are big and slow to turn, heavy armor, but their point defense looks weak, almost non-existent. If our sensors are right, they are not built for close, fast combat. They're built to intimidate." "Then we don't let them see us coming until it's too late," Voss said. "Nair, take us in low. Use the debris field near the third moon for cover. Reyes, plot firing solutions on the ships nearest the transports first. We save who we can save." The Requiem slid through the wreckage field like a shadow, its stealth systems humming, sensors sweeping constantly. The Kryvax ships had no idea anything was near them, until the first human torpedo struck the flank of their lead vessel and tore a hole clean through its unshielded engine section. The explosion lit up the black sky. On the bridge of the Kryvax flagship, Commander Vexithara froze in confusion. In all his years of service, no enemy had ever struck the fleet without warning. No enemy had ever moved fast enough to hide from Dominion sensors. He ordered his ships to fan out and return fire, but by the time his gunners located the source, the Requiem had already moved. Voss's plan was simple, but devastating. The Requiem never stayed in one place. It struck, moved, struck again, using the debris field to break enemy sensor locks every time. Its weapons were far more accurate than anything the Kryvax had ever needed to build, because humanity had learned, at terrible cost, that they could never win by outnumbering an enemy. They had to win by outthinking one. Reyes worked the targeting systems like an artist, picking off engines, weapon batteries, and command sections, instead of wasting fire on thick armor. One by one, the alien ships began to lose power, drifting helpless in the dark. Panic spread through the Kryvax formation. These soldiers had never trained for an enemy that fought back this way. Their entire doctrine was built on overwhelming numbers breaking enemy morale early. They had never needed real tactics, because no one had ever survived long enough to force them to use any. Vexithara screamed orders that his crews struggled to follow. Kryvax military culture did not reward independent thinking. Soldiers were trained to obey, not to adapt, because the Empire's endless numbers had always made adaptation unnecessary. Now, faced with a single ship that refused to behave the way a beaten enemy should, the alien crews began to break down in confusion and fear. 4 of the 12 ships were destroyed within the first hour. 3 more were crippled, drifting without power. The rest tried to regroup, but the Requiem kept moving through the chaos, appearing where it was least expected, vanishing before return fire could find it. On the bridge, sweat had begun to bead on Reyes's forehead, though not from fear. He was grinning as he worked. "Captain, they're pulling back. Formation's breaking apart." "Keep the pressure on the ones near the transports," Voss ordered. "Let the retreating ships go for now. Our job is to protect the colonists." The Requiem turned its attention fully to the last 3 ships, still hunting the fleeing transports. A tight spread of precision fire crippled their weapons, and within minutes those ships also turned and fled, joining the retreat of what remained of the fleet. Vexithara stared at his tactical display in disbelief. 8 of his 12 ships were gone or crippled. He had lost nearly 2/3 of his fleet to a single enemy vessel, a fraction of the size of any of his own ships. He did not understand what had happened. He only understood that he needed to leave before there was nothing left to report back with. The remaining Kryvax ships jumped away in a ragged, disorganized retreat, leaving behind the wreckage of their pride. On the Requiem's bridge, there was a moment of stunned silence before quiet cheering broke out. Voss did not join in right away. She watched the display, watched the drifting wreckage, watched the surviving transports limping toward the safety of the colony's remaining stations. She thought of the people already lost, the ones they had not reached in time. "Nair, status on the colony," she said. "Casualties heavy, but the colony still stands. Survivors report roughly 60% of the population made it to shelters before the attack began. We saved the rest of the transports, Captain. That's real." Voss allowed herself a small breath of relief. "Good. Begin rescue operations. Reyes, gather everything we can on those enemy ships, wreckage, sensor data, anything. We need to know who we just fought." Over the following hours, the Requiem's crew worked without rest, pulling survivors from damaged transports, treating the wounded, and scanning the drifting alien wreckage for information. What they found troubled Voss more than the battle itself. The technology inside the Kryvax ships was old, almost outdated by human standards, built more for size and intimidation than efficiency. Their weapons were powerful but crude. Their sensors were strong, but not built for stealth combat. Everything about the ship suggested an empire that had never needed to innovate, because nothing had ever forced it to. That was the part that worried her. An empire that size, an empire so confident it sent only 12 ships to test a random colony, was not going to let this defeat go unanswered. If this was truly a Dominion scouting force, then somewhere out in the dark, a much larger fleet was about to receive a report that would sound impossible. A single human ship had destroyed most of an attack force, and sent the rest fleeing in terror. Voss gathered her senior officers for a private briefing once the rescue operations were underway. "This is not the end of this," she told them. "This is the beginning. Whoever these Kryvacs are, they are not going to accept this quietly. We embarrass them, and empires like this do not forgive embarrassment." Nair crossed her arms. "So what do we do? Retreat to friendly space, warn command, let the fleet handle it?" "We do warn command," Voss said. "But we also stay here as long as we can. Perch needs protection, and we are the only protection they have. Besides," she paused, looking at the tactical display, at the drifting wreckage that had once been a fleet of conquerors. "I think we just learned something important today. They don't know how to fight an enemy that fights back. Their whole empire is built on fear, not skill. If that's true, then a small, smart ship might be worth more here than an entire fleet arriving too late." Reyes nodded slowly. "So we hold the line." "We hold the line," Voss agreed. "And we send everything we learned back home. If the Dominion sends more ships, we'll be ready. And if they send everything they have," she allowed herself a small, tired smile, "then we'll teach them a very expensive lesson." Far away, aboard a retreating Kryvax cruiser, limping toward Dominion space, Commander Vexithara prepared the most difficult report of his long career. He did not know how to explain what had happened. He did not know how to describe an enemy that moved like a ghost, struck like lightning, and somehow, impossibly, had beaten a fleet 3 times its size without losing a single ship of its own. All he knew was that somewhere in the vast, cold dark of the galaxy, the Dominion had just met something it had never met before, an enemy that was not afraid. And far behind him, drifting quietly near the smoking wreckage of a battle that should never have been winnable, the UNS Requiem held its post, waiting to see what would come next. Down on the surface of Perch, the rescue efforts continued long into the ship's night cycle. Shuttles from the Requiem moved back and forth between the colony's shelters and the ship's medical bay, carrying the wounded and the frightened. Voss made a point of walking through the medical bay herself, speaking with survivors, listening to their stories. An old miner named Douglas Farrow gripped her hand so tightly it left a mark, thanking her over and over, tears cutting clean lines through the dust on his face. "We thought we were dead," he said. "We saw those ships, and we thought that was it. Then this. This light came out of nowhere, and they just started dying. I never saw anything like it." Voss did not have the heart to tell him how close it had actually been, how a single mistake, a single moment of hesitation, could have ended very differently. Instead, she simply nodded and told him the colony would be protected for as long as the Requiem remained. Later, in her private quarters, she reviewed the sensor logs of the battle again and again, searching for anything she might have missed. Reyes had compiled a full analysis of the enemy ships, and the numbers troubled her more the longer she studied them. The Kryvax vessels carried weapons capable of leveling a city in a single strike, yet their gunners had aimed slowly, almost lazily, as if they had never needed to hit a moving target before. Their shields were strong enough to survive small arms fire from a dozen worlds, yet the ships had no coordinated defense pattern at all. It was, she realized, the profile of a military that had never truly been tested, an empire that grew through fear, not through war. That thought stayed with her long after the analysis was done. Somewhere out past the dark border of known space, there were thousands, maybe millions of worlds that had bent the knee to the Kryvax dominion without ever seeing what a real fight looked like. Species that had surrendered the moment the sky filled with enemy ships, because resistance had always seemed pointless. The Dominion did not need better weapons or smarter tactics. It only needed the reputation of being unbeatable. And reputations, Voss thought, were fragile things once someone proved them wrong. She called Reyes and Nair back to the bridge before the ship's dawn cycle began. "I want a full report sent to Fleet Command," she said. "Every scrap of data we have. Ship designs, weapon signatures, tactical weaknesses, everything. If the Dominion decides to come back in force, I want every human captain in the fleet to know what we know." "Already compiling it," Reyes said. "Should reach command in about 6 days at relay speed." "Good." Voss looked out at the starfield beyond the viewport, calm and endless, utterly indifferent to what had happened here. "And I want us ready before they get an answer to that report. Because if I'm right about what kind of enemy we just fought, they are not going to send 12 ships next time." Nair studied her captain for a long moment. You really think they'll come back? I know they will, Voss said quietly. An empire that size doesn't survive by forgiving insults. Somewhere out there, someone is reading a report right now that says a fleet of theirs was humiliated by a single ship a tenth its size. They are not going to let that story spread. They are going to want to erase it, and erase us with it. Then we'd better not make it easy for them, Reyes said. Voss allowed herself a faint smile, the first real one since the battle had ended. No, we won't. 3 days later, deep within Dominion territory, in a command chamber, built to hold 1,000 officers beneath the black stone spires of the capital world, Commander Vex Ithara stood before the Council of War and delivered his report. His voice shook as he described the battle, the impossible speed of the enemy ship, the precision of its strikes, the way it seemed to vanish and reappear at will. He spoke of losing 8 of 12 ships to a single vessel that never once took a direct hit. Silence filled the chamber when he finished. High Overlord Threx, ancient and scarred from centuries of easy conquest, stared down at the trembling commander with something between disbelief and fury. One ship, Threx said slowly, as if tasting the words. You are telling this council that one human ship destroyed 2/3 of an Imperial scouting fleet. Yes, Overlord, Vex Ithara whispered. The silence that followed was heavier than any explosion. For the first time in longer than most in that chamber could remember, the Dominion had heard of a defeat that made no sense within the rules it had always followed. And far across the stars, aboard a small, dark warship still holding its post, near a wounded colony, Captain Elena Voss was already preparing for the storm she knew was coming. High Overlord Threx did not sleep well after hearing Vex Ithara's report. For 3 centuries, the Kryvax Dominion had grown by simple math. Send more ships than the enemy could match, and the enemy would break before the first shot was even fired. It had worked on the Drenari, who surrendered after a single show of force. It had worked on the Ulthane, who begged for peace before the fleet even reached their home system. It had worked on countless other species, whose names had long since faded from Dominion records, absorbed into the endless machine of the Empire. It had never once failed. Until now. Threx called an emergency session of the War Council, on the second day after the report arrived, and this time he did not send a scouting force. He sent for General Draxus Kell, one of the most experienced fleet commanders in the Dominion military, a veteran of over 40 campaigns, none of which he had ever lost. Kell was a tall, broad alien with dark-plated skin and cold yellow eyes that had watched 1,000 enemy fleets surrender without a fight. You want me to bring an entire battle group against one ship? Kell asked, when the situation was explained to him. There was no fear in his voice, only mild confusion, as if he had been asked to use 100 soldiers to catch a single insect. Not just to destroy it, Threx said. To erase it. To erase the story of it. If word spreads that a human ship humiliated the Dominion and lived, other species under our rule may begin to remember that resistance is possible. That cannot happen. You will take 40 ships. You will find this human vessel, and every witness who might carry its story, and you will make sure nothing remains to be told. Kell bowed his head, still unconvinced that the mission required such caution, but he did not argue with the High Overlord. Within a day, his battle group was moving toward the human border, 40 warships strong, more firepower than most planets in that region of space had ever seen gathered in one place. Meanwhile, near the wounded colony of Perch, the crew of the UNS Requiem had spent the days since the battle, working without much rest. Repairs continued around the clock, damaged systems were patched, ammunition stores were restocked from a supply ship that Fleet Command had rushed out once Voss's report reached them, and slowly, quietly, more information began to trickle in from Command about exactly who humanity was now dealing with. It was Priya Nair who brought the file to Voss's ready room, a thick packet of old, half-classified records from the days before Voss had even joined the fleet. You should see this, she said, setting the tablet down on the desk. Command finally cleared us for the full history. This is about the Silence War. Voss had heard fragments of the Silence War before, the way most young officers had, in half-told stories and old memorial speeches. It was rarely spoken about in detail, because the truth of it had nearly broken humanity's spirit 40 years earlier. The Silence War had begun when an alien empire, smaller than the Kryvax Dominion but far more advanced in some areas, discovered Earth's early colonies and attacked without warning. Humanity, still new to the wider galaxy, had been completely unprepared. Entire colonies had been wiped out in the opening months. The old human fleets, built more for exploration than war, were destroyed one after another. For nearly 2 years, humanity stood on the edge of extinction, losing world after world, unable to match the enemy's technology or numbers. But humanity had one thing that enemy did not expect: a refusal to stop adapting. Every defeat became a lesson. Every destroyed ship became a redesign. Military doctrine changed overnight. Engineers worked around the clock, building smaller, faster, smarter ships instead of larger ones, because humanity could not win a war of numbers, only a war of skill. Soldiers were trained not just to follow orders but to think, to adapt, to find the smallest advantage in any fight, and use it without mercy. By the final year of the war, human ships a fraction of the size of the enemy's had begun turning the tide through sheer tactical brilliance, striking supply lines, disabling command ships, and using deception in ways the enemy had never encountered. The war ended not with a grand final battle, but with the enemy simply withdrawing, unwilling to keep paying the price for territory that had become far more costly than it was worth. Humanity had survived, but the cost had reshaped everything about how it built its military, and how it saw the galaxy. Since then, every human ship, every training program, every piece of doctrine had been built on one hard lesson: never assume you are safe just because you are small, and never assume an enemy is beaten just because they are outnumbered. Voss read through the file slowly, understanding for the first time exactly why the Requiem had been able to do what it did against the Kryvax scout fleet. It was not luck. It was the result of 40 years of hard lessons paid for in blood. "This explains a lot," she said quietly, setting the tablet down. "The Kryvax fight like an empire that has never had to learn any of this. They've never needed tactics, because nobody ever fought back long enough to force them to develop any. Which means," Nair said, "if they send something bigger next time, they'll probably still fight the same way. Overwhelming numbers, slow reactions, weak coordination." "Maybe," Voss said, "but we can't count on that. A smart commander learns from failure. If the officer we fought reports honestly, and if his superiors listen, the next fleet might come prepared for exactly what we did." Her instincts proved partly right, though not in the way she expected. 6 days after the battle at Perch, long-range sensors aboard the Requiem detected a massive gravitational disturbance at the edge of the system, the unmistakable signature of a large fleet dropping out of faster-than-light travel. "Report," Voss said sharply, already moving toward the command chair. Reyes's hands moved fast across his console, sensor data filling the screen. 40 ships, Captain. Confirmed Kryvax signatures, and these are not scout designs. These are battle cruisers, heavier armor, stronger shields, bigger guns. This is not a scouting force, this is a battle group." The bridge went quiet. 40 warships, each one likely equal to or stronger than any of the 12 they had faced before. Even with everything the Requiem had proven capable of, this was a different kind of fight entirely. "They're not trying to test us anymore," Nair said. "They're trying to end this." Voss studied the tactical display for a long moment, watching the enemy formations spread out at the edge of the system, a wall of firepower unlike anything a single ship should ever have to face. Somewhere behind that wall, a Kryvax commander was almost certainly expecting an easy, overwhelming victory, the same kind of victory the Dominion had always been able to claim. "Options," Voss said finally. "We could retreat," Nair offered, though her voice carried little conviction. "Fall back toward friendly space, let them chase us into range of border defenses. They'd catch us before we cleared the system," Reyes said. "Their engines are slower than ours, but not by enough to outrun 40 ships in open space without cover." Voss looked at the debris field, still drifting near the third moon, the wreckage of the first battle still scattered across local space, along with the asteroid belt further out, and the thick ion storms that regularly swept through the outer edge of the system, storms that played havoc with standard sensor arrays. "We use the terrain," she said. "Same as before, but bigger. We can't fight 40 ships head-on, not even with everything we've got. But we don't have to. We just have to make them think fighting us costs more than it's worth." "That's a big ask against a fleet that size," Reyes said. "It's the only ask we've got," Voss replied. "Nair, Plot a course into the ion storm at the edge of the system. If our sensors struggle in there, theirs will struggle worse, since our tech is built to compensate for exactly that kind of interference. Reyes, I want every mine we have left deployed along the approach vectors leading into the debris field. If they want to chase us in, they're going to pay for every meter. The crew moved with practice speed, the tension of the coming battle sharpening every motion. Within the hour, the Requiem had slipped into the swirling static of the ion storm, engines running quiet, weapons ready, waiting. On the bridge of his flagship, General Kell watched the human vessel disappear into the storm on his sensors, and felt the first flicker of something unfamiliar: caution. He had crushed 40 campaigns without ever needing to feel it, but the reports from Vexithara had been detailed enough to make even a confident commander wary. He ordered his fleet to advance slowly, in a tight defensive formation, weapons charged, sensors on full alert. It was, without him realizing it, already a small victory for the humans. The Dominion did not slow down for enemies. It had never needed to. Now, for the first time in longer than Kell could remember, an alien fleet moved into human territory with real caution in its approach, unaware that caution alone would not be enough to save them from what waited in the storm ahead. Aboard the Requiem, the crew worked in the dim red glow of battle stations, every station manned, every system running at full power despite the strain it placed on the reactor. Voss walked the length of the bridge slowly, checking on her people, offering a quiet word here and there. She stopped beside a young weapons technician named Sarah Kim, barely 23 years old, who had joined the crew only months before the mission to Perch. "First real fight?" Voss asked gently. Kim nodded, her hands steady on the console even though her voice shook slightly. "Yes, Captain. I mean, the first one was real too, but 40 ships is a lot." "It is," Voss agreed, not bothering to lie to her. "But numbers are not the only thing that decides a battle. Trust your training. Trust the people around you. That's how we win." Kim managed a small nod, some of the tension easing from her shoulders. Voss moved on, returning to the command chair as the storm outside grew thicker around the ship, streaks of ionized gas rolling past the viewport like slow, silent lightning. "Enemy fleet entering the debris field," Reyes reported. "They've slowed to half speed. Looks like they're being careful." "Good," Voss said. "Careful means slow, and slow means predictable. Nair, bring us around to the flank, along the path we mined. I want to be in position the moment they hit the first line." The Requiem moved like a shadow through the storm, engines whisper quiet, hull plating dark against the swirling gas clouds. On the enemy sensors, half blinded by the ion interference, the ship was little more than a faint ghost, there one moment and gone the next. The first mine detonated against the hull of a Kryvax cruiser near the front of the formation, tearing a hole through its outer armor, and venting atmosphere in a bright cloud of frozen crystal. Alarms blared across the enemy fleet. General Kell, watching from his flagship, felt his caution deepen into something closer to unease. "Minefield," he growled. They ceded the approach. "Order the fleet to slow further, sweep for additional hazards before advancing." It was exactly what Voss had hoped he would do. Every second the enemy fleet spent creeping forward cautiously was a second the Requiem used to reposition, to find new angles, to strike and vanish before return fire could ever find its source. A second mine took out the engines of another cruiser. A third crippled the sensor array of a support ship, blinding it to everything beyond visual range. Within the tangled storm and debris, the Requiem struck 3 more times over the next hour, each attack precise, each one aimed at systems rather than hulls, disabling ships instead of destroying them outright whenever possible, forcing the enemy fleet to spend resources protecting the wounded rather than pressing the attack. Kell's frustration grew with every report. His soldiers were trained to fight in the open, in overwhelming numbers, against enemies who broke and ran at the first sign of real resistance. They were not trained for this, for an enemy that refused to show itself, that turned the very battlefield into a weapon. "Concentrate sensor arrays," Kell ordered. "Full active scan, all ships. I want that ship found and destroyed, whatever the cost to our stealth." It was the mistake Voss had been waiting for. The moment the Kryvax fleet lit up their active sensors at full power, the Requiem systems locked onto the sudden surge of energy, tracing it back to its source with ease. Reyes grinned as the data filled his screen. "Captain, they just told us exactly where their flagship is." Then let's not waste the invitation, Voss said. Full spread, torpedo bay, target their command ship's engines and weapon batteries. Nair, prepare an immediate withdrawal vector the moment we fire. We hit hard, and we do not stay to admire the view. The Requiem surged forward through a gap in the debris field, weapons locked, and unleashed a full spread of precision torpedoes directly into the heart of the Kryvax formation. The strike tore through the flagship's shields, crippling 2 engine sections, and silencing an entire bank of weapon batteries in a single, devastating pass. Alarms screamed across General Kell's bridge as the ship shuddered violently beneath him. "Return fire," he bellowed, but by the time his gunners located a target, the Requiem had already vanished back into the storm, leaving behind only drifting wreckage and the sound of his own fleet's confused, scattered fire, hitting nothing but empty space and each other's shield emissions. For the first time in the battle, real fear crept into the voices on the Kryvax command channels. Soldiers who had spent their entire careers watching enemies surrender before the first shot now found themselves fighting an enemy they could not see, could not predict, and could not seem to stop no matter how many ships they brought to bear. Kell stared at the tactical display, watching another one of his ships go dark on the sensor grid, and felt something he had never truly felt in 40 years of easy campaigns. He felt afraid. "Pull the fleet back to defensive formation," he ordered, his voice tighter than before. "No more independent scanning. Group tight, minimal separation, full-point defense coverage." It was a sound tactical decision, and had it come earlier, it might have made the fight far harder for the Requiem, but it came too late. Fear had already begun to spread through the Kryvax ranks. The same fear the Dominion had spent centuries inflicting on others, now turned back against them for the very first time. And deep within the storm, calm and patient, the Requiem waited for its next opportunity to strike. The battle stretched on for nearly 6 more hours. Every time the Kryvax fleet tightened its formation, the Requiem found a new seam to exploit, a gap in coverage, a moment of hesitation, a supply ship drifting too far from its escorts. By the time General Kell finally gave the order to withdraw, his 40-ship battle group had been reduced to 26 functioning vessels, the rest destroyed, crippled, or too damaged to continue the fight. Not a single hit had landed on the Requiem's hull. On the bridge, the crew allowed themselves a brief moment of quiet celebration. Tired smiles and exhausted nods exchanged across every station. Voss did not join in fully, her eyes fixed on the tactical display, as the remaining Kryvax ships limped away into the dark, back toward whatever waited for them in Dominion space. "They'll be back," she said quietly, more to herself than to anyone else. "And next time, it won't be a general who underestimated us. It will be someone who's read every report, studied every mistake, and come prepared to fix them all." Reyes looked over at her, some of his earlier excitement fading into thoughtful concern. "You think they'll send someone bigger?" "I think," Voss said slowly, "that we just took something from them that matters more than ships or soldiers. We took their certainty. And an empire built entirely on the idea that it cannot lose is not going to let that go without throwing everything it has left at us." Far across the stars, in the black stone halls of the Dominion capital, that certainty was already crumbling. Word of Kell's defeat spread quickly through the highest ranks of the military, whispered in disbelief from officer to officer, a story that seemed impossible to believe, yet impossible to deny. High Overlord Threx sat alone in his private chamber that night, staring at the casualty reports, and made a decision that would change everything that came after. He summoned Grand Marshal Skarn, the most feared commander in the entire Dominion fleet, a warrior whose name alone had ended wars before they began. If a single human ship could defeat 2 of his best commanders, then it was time to stop sending soldiers to solve the problem, and start sending a legend instead. Grand Marshal Skarn had not lost a battle in over 200 years. His name was spoken in Dominion military academies as an example of perfect, unbreakable discipline. He had led the conquest of 11 star systems without ever needing to fire more shots than necessary, because word of his coming was usually enough to make lesser fleets surrender before he arrived. He did not believe in luck, and he did not believe in impossible enemies. When High Overlord Threx summoned him and told him the story of a single human ship defeating 2 Dominion battle groups, Skarn listened in silence, then asked only one question. "What is different about this ship?" Threx handed him every scrap of data the Dominion had gathered. Sensor logs, wreckage analysis, survivor reports from both failed battles. Skarn studied it for 3 full days without sleep, reading every detail with the same cold patience that had won him every war he had ever fought. By the end of it, he understood something that none of his predecessors had understood. "This is not a lucky ship," he told the council. "This is not an accident of design. This is a species that has learned how to fight through failure, and has built its entire military philosophy around exploiting exactly the weaknesses our forces have never needed to correct. We do not need more ships to defeat this enemy. We need better ones, positioned correctly, and commanded by someone who understands what they are truly facing." He requested 60 warships, a mix of heavy cruisers and fast interceptors, along with full authority to change standard Dominion battle doctrine for the engagement. Threx granted the request without hesitation. Within days, the largest and most capable fleet the Dominion had sent to the human border in living memory began its journey toward the small, wounded colony of Perch. Meanwhile, the crew of the UNS Requiem had spent the weeks since the battle with General Kell's fleet in careful preparation. Fleet Command, alarmed by the scale of the second attack, had finally begun moving additional resources toward the border, though the nearest reinforcements were still many days away. For now, the Requiem remained alone, its crew working around the clock to repair what damage they had taken, restock what supplies they could, and study everything they had learned about their enemy. Voss called a full briefing in the ship's main hall, gathering every senior officer and department head. A large display at the front of the room showed the tactical history of both battles, along with new intelligence gathered from long-range sensor drones Fleet Command had deployed along the border. "They're sending someone new," she told the room. "Long-range scans picked up a fleet forming near the Dominion's forward staging point 3 days ago. 60 ships, and this time the formation looks different. Tighter coordination, better spacing, ships positioned to cover each other's sensor blind spots. Whoever is commanding this fleet has studied what happened to the last 2. 60 ships, Nair repeated quietly. "That's not a battle group anymore. That's practically an invasion force." "It is," Voss agreed, "and I don't think we can rely on the same tricks working twice. If this commander is as smart as the formation suggests, they'll expect stealth attacks, minefields, ion storm cover. We need something new." Reyes leaned forward, arms crossed over his chest. "What do we actually know about how these ships work at a fundamental level? Because I've been going through the wreckage data from the last 2 fights, and there's something strange about their command structure." "Go on," Voss said. "Every ship we've fought relies almost entirely on direct orders from a central flagship," Reyes explained, pulling up a diagram on the main display. "Individual captains barely make independent decisions. When we knocked out command communication in the second battle, entire sections of their fleet just froze, waiting for orders that weren't coming. It's like their whole military culture is built on obedience instead of initiative." Voss studied the diagram carefully. "That fits with everything in the historical files on the Dominion. An empire that conquers through fear doesn't train its soldiers to think independently, because independent thought can lead to doubt, and doubt is dangerous to an empire built on the idea that resistance is always pointless. So if we can isolate their flagship again," Nair said slowly, "or better yet, cut off command communication across the whole fleet at once, we might be able to cause total chaos, not just damage to one ship." "That's the idea," Voss said. "But this new commander will expect us to go after the flagship. We need a plan built around what they'll expect, and then something they won't." The crew spent the following days developing exactly that plan, working with engineers to modify the Requiem's electronic warfare systems, designing a device capable of flooding Dominion communication frequencies with false signals across a wide area, not just disrupting a single ship's command link, but scrambling coordination across the entire fleet at once. It was risky, experimental technology, untested in real combat. But if it worked, it could turn Skarn's greatest advantage, his massive, coordinated fleet, into 60 separate ships, suddenly unable to trust any order they received. 4 days later, long-range sensors detected the Dominion fleet entering the outer edge of the system. 60 ships, moving in a tight, disciplined formation unlike anything the Requiem had faced before. At the center of the formation, larger and more heavily armored than any ship the humans had yet encountered, was Grand Marshal Skarn's flagship, the Voice of Judgment. "There he is," Reyes murmured, studying the massive vessel on the display. "That's not a scout ship or a battle cruiser. That's a command carrier, built for exactly the kind of coordination we're trying to disrupt." Voss stood at the center of the bridge, watching the enemy fleet approach with calm, focused eyes. "Then let's disrupt it properly. Nair, take us into the asteroid field near the fourth planet. Reyes, prepare the communication scrambler. I want it ready to deploy the moment they're fully committed to an attack pattern." The Requiem slipped into the shadow of the asteroid field as the Dominion fleet advanced, and this time, Skarn did not rush his approach. His ships moved with careful precision, sensor sweeps overlapping to cover every blind spot, support vessels holding tight formation with the heavier cruisers. It was, Voss realized as she watched, exactly the disciplined, patient approach she had feared. "He's not falling for the same tricks," Nair said quietly. "No active sensor bursts, no isolated ships to pick off. He's keeping everything tight." "Then we make him choose between staying tight and catching us," Voss said. She turned to Reyes. "Time to get his attention." The Requiem darted out from the asteroid field, weapons blazing, striking hard against the outer edge of the Dominion formation, before pulling back into cover. It was a smaller strike than before, deliberately so, just enough to provoke a reaction without overcommitting. On the bridge of the Voice of Judgment, Grand Marshal Skarn watched the attack unfold with cold, calculating patience. "They want us to break formation and chase them," he said, more to himself than to his officers. "Do not take the bait. Advance the full fleet together. Sweep the asteroid field methodically. Corner them instead of chasing them." It was, Voss realized as she watched the enemy fleet begin a slow, coordinated advance into the asteroid field rather than scattering to give chase. Exactly the kind of disciplined response she had hoped Skarn would eventually be forced into. Because a slow, coordinated advance meant 60 ships moving in tight formation, well within range of a communication scrambler designed to hit as many targets as possible at once. "Reyes," Voss said quietly. "Now." Reyes activated the scrambler, and a wave of false signals flooded Dominion communication frequencies across the entire advancing fleet. For a brief, chaotic moment, every ship in Skarn's formation received a flood of conflicting orders, some real, most fabricated, urging different maneuvers, different targets, different formations all at once. The disciplined, tight coordination that Skarn had relied on shattered instantly into confusion. Ships that had been holding careful formations suddenly scattered, some pulling back, others surging forward, a few opening fire on empty space where false sensor ghosts had appeared in their targeting systems. On the Voice of Judgment, alarms blared as Skarn's own communication systems flooded with static and false commands, and for the first time in 200 years, the Grand Marshal found himself commanding a fleet that could no longer hear him clearly. "Cut through the interference!" Skarn roared, but his engineers struggled against a system never designed to resist this kind of coordinated disruption. In the chaos, the Requiem struck again and again, targeting the scattered, confused ships one by one, each strike precise, each one landing on a vessel too disoriented to properly defend itself. The battle raged for hours through the asteroid field, the once perfectly disciplined Dominion fleet reduced to a scattered, confused mess of ships, struggling to coordinate even simple maneuvers. By the time Skarn finally managed to restore partial communication and pull his surviving forces back into a defensive formation, he had lost nearly half his fleet, more ships destroyed or crippled in a single engagement than in his entire 200-year career combined. Skarn stood on his damaged bridge, staring at the tactical display in a silence far colder than fury. He had studied every weakness of this human ship, prepared for every trick he believed it might use, and still, it had found a way to turn his own discipline, his own greatest strength, into the very thing that destroyed his fleet. "Signal full retreat," he said finally, his voice quiet and controlled, despite the storm of emotion beneath it. "We return to Dominion space. I need to understand this enemy properly before I face them again." As the remaining Dominion ships withdrew, word of the battle began to spread, far beyond the immediate chain of command. Traders who had witnessed the retreat carried the story to neighboring systems. Enslaved species long forced into obedience under Dominion rule began to whisper the tale among themselves, a story that seemed almost too strange to believe. A single human ship had now defeated 3 separate Dominion fleets, and even the legendary Grand Marshal Skarn had been forced to retreat. Aboard the Requiem, Exhausted but unbroken, Voss watched the last of the enemy ships vanish into the dark and allowed herself a rare moment of quiet reflection. They had won again, but the cost was mounting. The ship's systems were strained near their limits, her crew running on fumes and adrenaline, and somewhere out in the vast dark of Dominion space, an empire that had never known real resistance was beginning, for the first time in its long history, to feel something it had always inflicted on others. Fear. Down in the engine room, Chief Engineer Tomas Alvarez ran his hands over a cracked coolant line, shaking his head slowly at the damage the ship had taken during the long, grinding battle. The Requiem had come through without a single direct hull breach, but the strain of constant evasive maneuvers, weapon discharge, and the power drain of the communication scrambler had pushed every system close to its limits. "How bad is it?" Voss asked, arriving in the engine room still in her flight suit, hair damp with sweat from hours at the command chair. "Reactors holding, but barely," Alvarez said. "We burned through almost 40% of our reserve power cells running that scrambler at full output. If we'd needed it for another hour, we'd have been running on emergency backups alone. Shield emitters on the port side are fried, need at least 2 days to properly replace, and the secondary torpedo launcher jammed twice during the fight. I can patch most of this, but we need real dock time eventually, Captain. This ship has been fighting non-stop for weeks, with nothing but field repairs holding it together." Voss nodded, absorbing the report with the same calm focus she brought to every piece of bad news. "Do what you can. I'll push command again for a supply run and additional support. We can't keep doing this alone forever." "No," Alvarez agreed quietly. "We can't." That evening, Voss sat alone in her quarters, reviewing the casualty reports from the battle. Miraculously, the Requiem had suffered no deaths, though 11 crew members had been treated for injuries, ranging from minor burns to a fractured arm, suffered when a console exploded during one of the enemy's closer strikes. She thought of Sarah Kim, the young weapons technician, who had fought through the entire battle despite a deep cut along her forearm, refusing to leave her station until the fighting was over. She thought of Reyes, exhausted but still sharp, finding new angles of attack even as fatigue dragged at every member of the crew. She thought of all 200 people aboard this ship, ordinary men and women, who had somehow become the only thing standing between an ancient, merciless empire and the destruction of everything humanity had built. It was a heavy weight to carry, and she carried it quietly, the way a good captain always did. Far across the dark expanse of space, in the black stone halls of the Dominion capital, Grand Marshal Skarn stood before High Overlord Threx and the full War Council, for the first time since his defeat. The chamber was silent as he spoke, describing not just the battle, but everything he had come to understand about the enemy that had broken his perfect record. "This is not a fluke of tactics," Skarn said, his voice carrying the weight of 200 years of unbroken authority now humbled. "This is a species that has built its entire way of war around defeating exactly the kind of empire we are. They do not fear us, because they have already survived something worse. Every weakness in our doctrine, our reliance on central command, our lack of independent initiative among lower officers, our sensors built for intimidation rather than precision combat, they have identified and exploited, each one with surgical precision." "Then what do you propose?" Threx demanded, his ancient voice tight with barely controlled anger. "I propose we stop treating this as a single battle to be won," Skarn said. "This is a war, Overlord, whether we choose to name it as such or not. If we continue sending fleets piecemeal, this human ship, and whatever reinforcements eventually arrive to support it, will continue to bleed us dry, one battle group at a time. We need to commit everything, a full invasion fleet, hundreds of ships, enough force that no amount of clever tactics can overcome sheer, overwhelming numbers, applied correctly, and without hesitation." A murmur ran through the council chamber at the size of the commitment being suggested. Sending hundreds of ships to deal with a single human vessel and a wounded frontier colony seemed, to many present, an almost absurd overreaction. But Threx had seen the reports, had watched 3 fleets fail in succession, and understood better than most in the room exactly what was truly at stake. It was not really about one ship anymore. It was about the story of that ship, spreading now through every corner of Dominion space, whispered among slaves and free species alike. A story that suggested, for the first time in the Empire's long history, that the Dominion could be beaten. Left unanswered, that story alone could unravel centuries of carefully maintained fear and obedience. "Prepare the invasion fleet," Threk said finally, his voice heavy with the weight of the decision. "Full mobilization. I want this ended, Grand Marshal. And I want it ended so completely that no one in this galaxy ever dares whisper that story again." Skarn bowed low, understanding the true scale of what he had just been given command over. Not merely a battle group, but the largest single military force the Dominion had assembled in over a century, gathering now to descend upon a single wounded frontier system, and the one small, defiant ship still standing guard over it. Word of the coming storm reached the Requiem 5 days later, carried through a priority transmission from Fleet Command that made even Voss's steady composure falter for a moment as she read it aloud to her senior staff. "Long-range sensor drones along the border have detected the largest gravitational disturbance ever recorded near Dominion territory," she read. "Preliminary estimates suggest a fleet numbering in the hundreds, currently massing near their forward staging point. Fleet Command believes this to be a full invasion force, likely intended for the Perch system." She lowered the tablet slowly, looking around at the tired, determined faces of her officers. "They're not sending another battle group. They're sending everything." The bridge was silent for a long moment before Nair finally spoke. "Captain, we can't fight hundreds of ships alone, not even with everything we've learned, not even with every trick we have left." "No," Voss agreed quietly, "we can't." Not alone. She looked toward the star field beyond the viewport, calm, despite the storm gathering somewhere far beyond it. "But we're not the only ones fighting this war anymore. It's time to remind Fleet Command exactly what we've spent 40 years preparing for." Fleet Admiral Elias Cho had spent 40 years preparing for a day he hoped would never come. As a young officer, he had fought in the final battles of the Silence War, had watched friends and comrades die, learning the lessons that now formed the backbone of every human military doctrine. When Voss's reports had first reached Fleet Command months ago, describing a single ship's battle against an unknown alien scout force, he had read them with the same quiet, careful attention he gave every piece of intelligence from the border. When the reports grew larger, describing battle groups and grand marshals and fleets in the dozens, he had begun quietly moving resources toward the frontier, preparing for exactly the scenario now unfolding. Not surprised when the final message arrived from the Requiem, describing a Dominion invasion fleet numbering in the hundreds, massing to erase a single wounded colony, and the one ship still defending it. He had expected this moment for weeks. What surprised him, if anything, was how calm he felt as he stood before the assembled leadership of Earth's government and laid out what needed to happen next. "We have been building the second fleet in secret for 6 years, he told them, his voice steady despite the enormity of what he was revealing. "Since the end of the Silence War, this council has understood that the peace we found was temporary, that somewhere out in the dark, another empire would eventually test us again. We built 240 ships in hidden shipyards along the outer colonies, trained crews in complete secrecy, and prepared for exactly this scenario. The time to reveal that fleet has come." There were questions, hesitations, the natural fear of committing everything to a single, uncertain battle. But Cho had spent too many years preparing for this exact moment to allow doubt to slow him down now. Within hours, orders went out across human space, activating a fleet that had existed only in classified files and hidden construction yards for the better part of a decade. The second fleet would take 12 days to reach the border, even at maximum speed. 12 days that the Requiem, alone and already worn thin from 3 brutal engagements, would somehow have to survive. Aboard the Requiem, Voss received the news of the Second Fleet's activation with a mixture of relief and grim determination. Relief, because it meant humanity was not facing this threat with a single ship after all. Grim determination, because 12 days was a very long time to hold a line against hundreds of enemy warships with nothing but one battered vessel and whatever damaged colony defenses remained at Perch. 12 days, Reyes said quietly, staring at the timeline Fleet Command had provided. "Captain, we barely survived Skarn's 60 ships. The fleet massing near the border now is reported at over 300. "I know," Voss said, "but we don't need to defeat them, Reyes. We need to survive them, delay them, bleed them, for 12 days. Every hour we buy is an hour closer to reinforcement." Aboard the lead ship of the Second Fleet, the newly commissioned UNS Horizon, Admiral Cho stood on the bridge watching the stars blur past as the fleet raced toward the border at maximum sustainable speed. 240 ships, the culmination of 6 years of secret construction, secret training, and secret sacrifice, moved together through the dark in a formation more disciplined than anything the Dominion had ever encountered. Every captain in that fleet had studied Voss's battle reports in detail. Every crew had drilled relentlessly on the same hard-won lessons from the Silence War that had shaped humanity's entire way of fighting. Cho had chosen not to reveal the fleet's existence, even to most of his own government, until this moment of necessity, understanding the risk of moving too early, of showing humanity's hand before it was needed. Now, with the Requiem standing alone against an armada that outnumbered it more than 300 to 1, that caution had reached its absolute limit. "Time to the border?" he asked his navigator. "At current speed, 12 days, Admiral. We cannot safely push the drive cores any faster without risking catastrophic failure across the fleet." Cho nodded slowly, doing the mental math he had already run a dozen times since receiving the news of the invasion fleet's detection. 12 days. He did not know if the Requiem could survive that long against such overwhelming numbers, but he knew, with absolute certainty, that his fleet could not arrive any faster, without tearing itself apart in the attempt. All he could do now was push forward as fast as safely possible, and trust in the ship, and the captain, holding the line at the edge of human space. "Then we make every one of those 12 days count," he said quietly. "Full speed. No delays, no detours. Every hour matters." The days that followed were spent in desperate preparation. Every remaining mine was deployed across the approaches to the system. Every spare part on the ship was used to reinforce weak points in the hull and shield systems. Alvarez and his engineering team worked without sleep, coaxing every last percentage of efficiency out of systems already pushed far beyond their intended limits. Voss ordered the evacuation of what remained of Perch's population to deep shelters on the far side of the system, buying what little extra safety she could for the civilians who had already suffered so much. On the 9th day since the invasion fleet's detection, long-range sensors finally confirmed what everyone aboard the Requiem had been dreading. Grand Marshal Skarn's massive armada, now numbering 312 ships, dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the system, an invasion force so vast it seemed to blot out the stars themselves on the tactical display. "That's not a fleet," Nair whispered, staring at the overwhelming wall of enemy signatures filling the screen. "That's an apocalypse." Voss stood at the center of the bridge, her face calm, despite the impossible odds now displayed before her. She thought of the 12 days Fleet Command needed, the 3 days that remained, and the single, small ship that stood as the only thing between this armada and everything humanity had built. "Full alert," she said quietly. "Battle stations. Every system to maximum output. We are not winning this fight. We are buying time, and we are going to buy every second we possibly can." The battle that followed would later be remembered, by those who survived it, and those who studied it for generations afterward, as one of the most desperate and impossible last stands in the history of human warfare. The Requiem struck from the shadows of the debris field, from the cover of the ion storm, from every hidden angle its crew had mapped and prepared over the preceding weeks, inflicting damage far beyond what a single ship should have been capable of. But 300 ships were not 60, and even the most brilliant tactics could not fully offset the sheer, crushing weight of numbers now bearing down on them. Skarn, having learned bitterly from his previous defeat, deployed his fleet with far greater caution this time, spreading his ships wide enough to prevent any single strike from causing the kind of cascading chaos that had broken his formation before. He used smaller, independent squadrons rather than one massive coordinated body, sacrificing some efficiency in exchange for resilience against exactly the kind of disruption tactics the humans had proven so devastatingly effective. It worked. Slowly, painfully, the Requiem began to take damage it could not simply repair and continue fighting through. A glancing hit from a heavy cruiser tore through the outer hull, near the engineering section, on the second day of the battle, injuring 3 crew members and knocking out a full bank of secondary shield emitters. Alvarez and his team worked desperately to patch the damage even as the fighting continued around them, sparks and emergency lighting casting harsh shadows across the strained faces of engineers who had not slept properly in days. Voss herself took a shrapnel wound to the shoulder during an emergency evasive maneuver on the second night, when a stray hit rocked the bridge hard enough to throw her from the command chair into a console. She refused to leave her post, allowing the ship's medic to patch the wound with a field dressing while she continued issuing orders, her voice steady even through the pain. "Captain, you need proper treatment," the medic insisted. "After," Voss said simply, and returned her attention to the tactical display. Down in the crew quarters between shifts, exhaustion had begun to show on every face. Sarah Kim sat slumped against a bulkhead during a rare 15-minute rest period, eyes closed but unable to truly sleep, the distant rumble of the ship's weapons still firing somewhere above her. Beside her, a young engineering technician named Marcus Whitfield offered her a ration bar she did not have the energy to eat. "You think we're going to make it?" he asked quietly, his voice barely audible over the constant hum of the ship's overworked systems. Kim considered the question for a long moment before answering. "I think the captain hasn't given up, so I'm not going to either." It was not much of an answer, but it was enough to make Whitfield nod, and the two of them sat together in tired, determined silence until the alert klaxon called them both back to their stations. On the bridge, Nair worked alongside Voss to track the shifting battle lines, watching as Dominion squadrons probed at different sections of the debris field, testing for weaknesses, forcing the Requiem to constantly reposition, constantly adapt. Every maneuver drained power reserves that were no longer fully recovering between engagements. Every strike the ship managed to land came at the cost of exposing itself, however briefly, to return fire from dozens of directions at once. "We're bleeding out slower than they are," Reyes reported grimly, during a brief lull in the fighting. "But we're still bleeding. At this rate, we've got maybe another day and a half before weapon systems drop below effective combat threshold." "Then we make that day and a half count," Voss said, though even she could hear the strain beginning to show at the edges of her own voice. "Nair, reroute auxiliary power from life support in unused sections to the shield emitters. Reyes, prioritize targeting on their supply and repair vessels. If we can't outfight them, we can at least make sure every ship they lose stays lost." The tactic worked, buying precious additional hours, but the fundamental math of the battle remained unchanged. 300 ships, however cautiously deployed, however much damage the Requiem managed to inflict in return, would eventually overwhelm a single vessel through sheer persistence alone. Everyone on the bridge understood this, even as they continued fighting with everything they had left. By the third day, the Requiem was a shadow of the ship it had been when the battle began. Nearly half its weapon systems were offline or operating at reduced capacity. Shield strength hovered at barely 30%, unable to fully regenerate between engagements. The crew, exhausted beyond anything they had trained for, continued fighting through sheer stubborn will, running on adrenaline, and the simple, desperate knowledge that every hour they survived brought reinforcement closer. Still, Skarn's fleet had paid a heavy price for every gain. 40 ships destroyed or crippled beyond repair, dozens more damaged and forced to retreat for emergency repairs, an armada that had begun the battle with over 300 ships, now numbering closer to 250 capable vessels. It was, by any measure the Dominion had ever used before, an unthinkable cost to pay against a single crippled enemy ship. On the bridge of the Voice of Judgment, Grand Marshal Skarn watched the battle unfold, with a grim, exhausted respect he had never expected to feel for an enemy. "They should have surrendered days ago," he said quietly to his second-in-command. "Any other species we have faced would have surrendered after the first hour of this, and still they fight." "Orders, Grand Marshal?" his officer asked. Skarn was silent for a long moment, staring at the tactical display, at the small, battered human ship still somehow moving, still somehow striking back despite everything his armada had thrown against it. "Continue the advance," he said finally. "Full commitment. Whatever it costs, this ends today." Aboard the Requiem, alarms blared through every section of the ship as the full weight of Skarn's remaining fleet began to close in. Hundreds of ships converging from every direction, weapons charging, an inescapable wall of firepower bearing down on a single, exhausted vessel that had already given everything it had left to give. "Captain," Reyes said, his voice tight with something close to despair as he studied the closing formation. "We can't outrun this. We can't outmaneuver this. There's too many of them, coming from too many directions." Voss looked at the display, at the impossible wall of enemy ships closing in around them, and felt, for the first time since this entire ordeal began, the cold, quiet weight of an ending she could not fight her way out of. She thought of her crew, of Kim and Alvarez, and Reyes, and Nair, and all 200 souls who had trusted her judgment through every impossible battle that had led them here. She thought of the people of Perch, finally safe in deep shelter, who would never know just how close the ship protecting them had come to failing. "All hands," she said, her voice carrying through the ship's comm system, steady despite everything. "This is the captain. We knew this might be the cost when we chose to hold this line. I am proud, beyond words, of every single one of you. Whatever happens next, know that we did not fail. We bought every second we possibly could." She turned back to the tactical display, watching the enemy formation close the final distance, weapon systems across the Requiem straining to hold together for one last, desperate defense. Nair reached over and gripped Voss's uninjured shoulder for a brief moment, no words needed between them after everything they had survived together. Reyes kept his hands steady on the weapons console, ready to fire every last shot the ship had left the moment the enemy came into range. Down in engineering, Alvarez and his exhausted team braced themselves against the bulkheads, having done everything humanly possible to keep the ship alive this long. Throughout the vessel, 200 tired, frightened, unbroken people held their positions, waiting for whatever came next, refusing to abandon their posts, even as the wall of enemy ships filled every screen on the bridge. And then, in the final seconds before the enemy's opening volley would have struck home, the ship's sensors screamed a sudden violent alert, a wave of massive gravitational disturbances erupting across the edge of the system. Dozens, then hundreds of new signatures blooming into existence on the tactical display all at once. Reyes stared at the readings, in stunned disbelief for a long moment, before his voice broke through the tense silence of the bridge. "Captain, those are human FTL signatures. Fleet Command IFF codes confirmed." Voss felt her breath catch in her chest as she turned to the viewport, watching the dark edge of the system begin to fill with the unmistakable shape of an approaching armada. Hundreds of human warships dropping out of faster-than-light travel in perfect formation, arriving at the very last possible moment to answer a call that had been sent 12 long, desperate days ago. The second fleet had arrived. For a long, breathless moment, no one on the bridge of the Requiem moved. The wall of enemy ships that had seemed like a certain end only seconds before now hesitated, sensors across the Dominion fleet suddenly registering the impossible scale of the force arriving behind them. 240 human warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel in perfect formation, weapons already charged, engines already burning hot from 12 days of maximum sustained speed. On the bridge of the Voice of Judgment, Grand Marshal Skarn stared at the new readings in stunned disbelief. In 200 years of unbroken victory, he had never once faced an enemy fleet of this size, arriving with this kind of precision, at exactly the moment his own forces were stretched thin and exhausted from 3 days of relentless fighting against a single, stubborn ship. "Report," he demanded, though the sensor data spoke clearly enough on its own. 240 vessels, Grand Marshal," his tactical officer replied, voice tight with barely controlled fear. "Formation analysis suggests full battle readiness. They are not a relief convoy. This is a second invasion fleet." Skarn understood, in that moment, the full and terrible truth of what his forces had actually been fighting these past 3 days. It had never been a single ship standing alone against the might of the Dominion. It had been a single ship buying time, holding a line, sacrificing everything it had to give in order to let a much larger force arrive at exactly the right moment to turn the tide of an entire war. Aboard the Requiem, Voss felt something loosen in her chest that she had not even realized was wound so tight. "Reyes, confirm IFF. I want to be absolutely certain before we celebrate." "Confirmed, Captain," Reyes said, a broad, exhausted grin spreading across his tired face. "That's the second fleet. That's Admiral Cho's flagship leading the formation. They made it." A ragged cheer broke out across the bridge, exhaustion and relief mixing together in a wave of emotion that swept through every station. Voss allowed herself a single, deep breath before pulling her focus back to the tactical display, back to the battle that was far from over even with reinforcement finally arrived. "Save the celebration," she said, though there was warmth beneath the discipline in her voice. "We've still got a fight to finish. Nair, signal the Second Fleet. Coordinate our remaining weapon systems with their formation. Let's make sure the last 3 days weren't for nothing." The arrival of the Second Fleet transformed the battle instantly. Where moments before the Requiem had faced an overwhelming, inescapable wall of enemy ships alone, now that wall found itself caught between a battered, but still fighting human vessel on one side, and 240 fresh, disciplined warships bearing down from the other. Skarn's exhausted, depleted fleet, already reduced from 312 ships to barely 250, after 3 grueling days of combat, now faced a force nearly equal in size, rested, fully supplied, and burning with the momentum of a rescue, arriving in the final possible moment. Admiral Cho's voice came through the Requiem's comm system moments after the Second Fleet completed its arrival maneuvers. "Captain Voss, this is Admiral Cho. We read your ship's condition. You've done more than enough. Fall back behind our line and let us finish this." Voss looked at her exhausted, battered crew, at the strained systems still somehow holding together across the ship, and felt a fierce, quiet pride swell in her chest. "With respect, Admiral," she said, "we've held this line for 3 days. We'd like to see it through to the end, if it's all the same to you." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line, and when Cho's voice returned, there was clear respect in it. "Understood, Captain. Take position on our flank. Let's finish this together." The battle that followed was unlike anything the Dominion had ever experienced. For the first time, they faced not a single unpredictable ship, but an entire fleet, built and trained using the same hard-won lessons that had made the Requiem so devastatingly effective. 240 ships moved with the same precision, the same willingness to adapt, the same refusal to rely on overwhelming numbers alone that had defined humanity's entire approach to war since the dark days of the Silence War. Skarn's fleet, already exhausted and depleted, could not match the sudden, coordinated assault now bearing down on them from every angle. Human ships struck with surgical precision, targeting engines, weapon systems, and command vessels with the same tactics that had crippled 3 previous Dominion fleets, now multiplied across an entire armada instead of a single lone vessel. Communication scramblers, deployed across dozens of human ships simultaneously, threw the already strained Dominion command structure into complete disarray. Squadrons that had barely managed to maintain cohesion under Skarn's careful management before now scattered entirely, unable to coordinate any kind of meaningful defense against an enemy that seemed to understand every weakness in their doctrine. On the bridge of the Voice of Judgment, Skarn watched his once mighty armada disintegrate around him, ship after ship going dark on his tactical display, and understood, with the cold clarity of a soldier who had spent 2 centuries studying victory, that this battle was already lost. He had faced impossible odds many times in his career, but always from the winning side. Now, for the first time, he understood exactly what it felt like to stand on the other end of an unstoppable, overwhelming force. "All ships, immediate withdrawal," he ordered, his voice heavy with the weight of an unprecedented defeat. "Any vessel capable of faster-than-light travel is to retreat toward Dominion space immediately. We cannot win this engagement." The retreat itself became chaotic in ways Dominion doctrine had never accounted for. Ships that had spent their entire existence trained only to advance under overwhelming numbers now found themselves scrambling to escape a battlefield where the numbers no longer favored them. Captains who had never once needed to make an independent tactical decision suddenly found themselves cut off from central command, forced to choose between standing and fighting or breaking formation to save their crews. Many chose to run, abandoning damaged sister ships rather than risk destruction themselves, a scattering of self-preservation that would have been unthinkable under the Dominion's usual doctrine of absolute obedience. Not every ship escaped. By the time the last of Skarn's fleet vanished into faster-than-light retreat, barely 90 ships remained of the 312 that had arrived at Perch only days before. A devastating, unprecedented loss that would echo through Dominion military history for generations to come. The Voice of Judgment itself limped away, heavily damaged, its once legendary commander forced to carry news of the single greatest defeat the Dominion had suffered in over a century. Aboard the Requiem, as the last enemy ships vanished from sensor range, the bridge fell into a stunned, exhausted silence, broken only by the quiet hum of overworked systems finally allowed to power down from full combat readiness. Voss sank back into her command chair, the adrenaline that had carried her through 3 days of relentless battle finally beginning to fade, leaving behind a deep, bone-tired exhaustion. "Captain," Nair said softly, "we did it. We actually did it." Voss looked around the bridge, at Reyes slumped forward over his console in relieved exhaustion, at Nair's tired but genuine smile, at every station manned by crew members who had given everything they had over the past weeks and somehow, impossibly, survived to see this moment. "We didn't do it alone," she said quietly. "But yes, we held the line." Admiral Cho himself came aboard the Requiem in person once the battle had fully ended, walking the length of the damaged ship with quiet respect, taking in the scorched consoles, the patched hull sections, the exhausted but proud faces of a crew that had accomplished something he doubted any other ship in the fleet could have managed. He found Voss still on the bridge, her shoulder finally properly bandaged, watching over the final cleanup reports with tired but steady eyes. "Captain Voss," he said, extending a hand as he approached the command chair. "I've read every report to come out of this system over the past few weeks. I still find it difficult to believe half of what's written in them, and I watched the last day of it happen with my own eyes." Voss shook his hand, managing a small, exhausted smile. "We had good reasons to keep fighting, Admiral. A colony full of people who deserved a chance, and a crew who refused to let each other down. That's most of what carried us through." Cho studied her for a long moment, the kind of look a man gives when he recognizes he is standing in the presence of something history will remember long after both of them were gone. "For what it's worth, Captain, Fleet Command will want to study everything your ship did here for years to come. You didn't just win a battle. You rewrote what we thought a single ship could accomplish against impossible odds." "With respect, Admiral," Voss said, "I'd rather Fleet Command spent that time making sure no other single ship ever has to do this again." Cho considered that for a moment, then nodded slowly, something like quiet approval in his expression. "Fair enough, Captain. Fair enough." Over the following weeks, the Requiem underwent extensive repairs, at a forward support station rushed into operation near the border, while the Second Fleet secured the region and began coordinating the long process of stabilizing the frontier. Voss visited her crew often during this period, checking on the wounded, sharing quiet meals with exhausted officers, making sure that the people who had carried her through the darkest days of the battle knew exactly how much their captain valued each of them. Sarah Kim, her arm now properly healed, was recommended for early promotion, a recognition she accepted with the same quiet determination she had shown throughout the entire ordeal. Reyes and Nair were both offered command postings of their own, aboard new ships being rushed into service as humanity began rapidly expanding its fleet in the aftermath of Perch, though both, for different reasons, chose to remain aboard the Requiem a while longer, unwilling to leave the ship, or the captain, that had carried them through so much. In the days that followed, the full scale of what had happened at Perch became clear across both human and Dominion space. For humanity, it marked the moment the wider galaxy first understood the true strength of a species that had once been dismissed as small, isolated, and insignificant. Fleet Admiral Cho's Second Fleet, combined with the legendary stand of the Requiem, had not only saved a single frontier colony, but had shattered the myth of Dominion invincibility in a single, decisive engagement. For the Kryvax Dominion, the defeat at Perch triggered consequences far beyond the battlefield itself. Word of the loss spread rapidly through every corner of the Empire, carried by traders, by prisoners, by the countless enslaved species who had spent centuries believing resistance was impossible. High Overlord Threx, already facing pressure from rival factions within his own court, found his authority questioned for the first time in decades. Grand Marshal Skarn, humiliated by the greatest defeat of his long career, retired quietly from active command, his once unblemished record forever marked by the story of the ship that would not break. Across dozens of subjugated worlds, small acts of resistance began appearing where none had existed before, inspired by whispered stories of a single human ship that had faced impossible odds and refused to surrender. The Dominion, an empire built entirely on the foundation of fear and inevitability, found that foundation cracked in a way that centuries of absolute power had never prepared it to repair. Back at Perch, the colony slowly began to rebuild, its people forever changed by the battle that had raged above their world. A memorial was raised near the colony's main settlement, a simple stone marker bearing the names of everyone lost during the attack, alongside a small plaque honoring the crew of the UNS Requiem, the ship that had refused to let their home fall. Captain Elena Voss received the highest honors Fleet Command could offer, though she accepted them with the same quiet humility that had defined her command throughout the entire ordeal. When asked, months later, by a young reporter what she wanted people to remember most about the battle at Perch, she thought for a long moment before answering. "I want people to remember that we weren't special," she said. "We were just prepared. We learned, a long time ago, that surviving isn't about being the biggest or the strongest. It's about refusing to give up, adapting faster than your enemy expects, and trusting the people beside you completely." The Dominion built an empire on the idea that fear makes resistance pointless. We proved that idea wrong. That's all this was, really. Just proving an old, cruel lie wrong, one battle at a time. The war between humanity and the Kryvax Dominion did not end at Perch. It was, in many ways, only truly beginning, the opening chapter of a much longer struggle that would reshape the balance of power across a significant portion of the galaxy in the years that followed. But the battle at Perch remained forever, the moment everything changed. The moment a single human warship entered a battlefield it should never have survived, and left behind an empire that had, for the first time in its long and merciless history, forgotten how to fight with anything but fear. And fear, as the Dominion would slowly come to learn, was a weapon that only worked on those who still believed they could not win. Years later, historians studying the early conflicts between humanity and the Kryvax Dominion would point to the battle at Perch as the true turning point in the balance of power across that region of space. Not because it was the largest battle of the eventual war, nor the most costly in terms of lives or ships lost on either side, but because it was the first time an ancient, seemingly unstoppable empire learned that its greatest weapon, the simple belief that it could never be beaten, was nothing more than a story that had never truly been tested. Once that story broke, it could never be fully repaired, no matter how many fleets the Dominion later sent, no matter how many worlds it continued to hold under its grip. The UNS Requiem itself became something of a legend throughout human space, its name taught in military academies, alongside the hardest lessons of the Silence War, its crew honored not as untouchable heroes, but as ordinary people who had simply refused to stop fighting when everything told them to give up. Captain Elena Voss went on to a long and distinguished career, eventually rising through the ranks of Fleet Command, though she never forgot the quiet colony of Perch, or the crew who had stood beside her through those impossible, unforgettable days. Somewhere far out along the edge of known space, past the last friendly star, the small mining colony of Perch continued its quiet existence, its people forever marked by what they had witnessed, forever grateful to the single ship that had entered an unwinnable battlefield, and simply, stubbornly, refused to lose. And across the wider galaxy, in whispered stories passed between enslaved worlds and free ones alike, the tale of that ship continued to spread, a small, steady reminder that even the mightiest empire built on fear could, in the end, be made to forget how to fight.